Okay, and so now we're live. Karen, go for it.
Hi everyone, I'm Karen and welcome to our Google Plus Microbiology Journal Club Hangouts. And so this month, normally what we do is we cover different journal articles that are interesting that we found online or that people are tweeting about, and we talk about them. But in the summer, we like to take a nice and relaxing break from our academic work, and we read a various series of interesting interesting microbiology books, and we call that our summer book club. And this summer book club, we are kicking off with this book, which is Pandemic by Sonia Shea and Shana Shea, Sonia Shah. I don't know how to pronounce her name, but we're going to read this book, but before we do that, let's just go around and introduce all the people that are here and all the fantastic people that have joined us. And so to my left is Nicole, so I'll let Nicole start off.
Hi there, I'm Nicole Scipio. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Northern British Columbia, and some of you may have seen me on Twitter under the handle Old Dusty. I am basically involved in a project where we dig shallow holes and see what the microbial community composition is like after we fill them in.
That's very cool. I didn't actually know that, so that's really interesting. Yeah. So next to Nicole, I have Laura. So Laura, why don't you go next?
Okay, I had to unmute myself. I'm Laura Williams. I'm an assistant professor at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island, and I study predatory bacteria. And we also have a couple of projects looking at the gut microbiome of different creatures like monkeys and rats, and also with a kind of digester system that one of our physics professors is working on. So we are in the middle of our summer research program. And so we've got, I think this is the midpoint, I think, actually. So we've been 5 weeks, we've got 5 weeks coming, and a couple of our students just presented at ASM in Boston, and that went really well for them. So we're very excited about the kind of wrapping up the program and thinking about the fall semester, which is why I need to read this book so I can figure out if our non-majors should be reading it for our micro class. So that is me.
And absolutely, I think this book also lends really well to give an introduction to pandemics, and it reads very well as well. And so we'll get more into that. Joel, how about you? Why don't you go next?
All right. So I'm Joel Graff. I'm at Montana Tech. And is my logo backwards? It looks backwards to me. My name tag at the bottom?
No, it's straight. I see it as straight.
Okay, I'll stop worrying about it then. Anyway, I just started at Montana Tech half a year ago, and I'm getting research up and running in my lab, mostly ordering stuff at this time. But I had thoughts of reading this book before Laura had proposed it to read, and so I went for it. And I did listen to the audio version, which I don't necessarily recommend because there's a little bit of a reverb that just kind of drove me nuts. But anyway, I'm 90% through the book, so not quite done. But I'll join the discussion anyway.
Well, I think what I'm going to structure the discussion is that so in a way that I think everyone will get to talk about their interesting parts of the book, and even if you haven't read all of the book, we'll at least be able to talk about the interesting topics, and maybe if you find that interesting, you can give us more of an outline or a description of why you find it interesting, not only for you, Joel, but for also people who are watching and they haven't read the book yet. Actually, I just realized I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Karen. I'm a PhD student that's almost graduating from Simon Fraser University. I'm in the last months of the throe of the PhD, which, as many of you know, are exciting and depressing at the same time. I really appreciate that I had this book to take me away from doing all of my thesis work, because it was a nice and relaxing break. And at the same time, I love and are interested in all aspects of microbes, and so this book provided me with a lot of very good background info on just exactly what Laura tweeted, which was the social, the political, the economic, and the biological, and all of those things coming together in the context of pandemics. And so I'm also hoping that Mark will be able to join back with us. Mark is one of the people who joins us often. He is one of our microbial musketeers, which you see in my t-shirt. He actually bought this for me.
Oh, you got the shirt!
Yeah, I got the shirt.
Yay!
Yeah, so I wanted to show Mark that I got the shirt, but I hope he comes back.
He's trying to come back. He said his computer dropped. The IT folks recently updated his computer, and we don't know how that goes. So we'll see.
Well, I hope that Mark comes back. For those of you who don't normally join us, Mark is what Mark, Laura, and I are common. We have been in this process of the micro journal hangout since the beginning, and in that sense, so that's why we've started calling ourselves the Microbial Musketeers, just the three of us, and we all love to discuss things about microbes, and so that's why it's. I'll talk about it later. Okay. Anyway, on to the book. So in the book, the book itself by Sonia has done this very nice background on, like I mentioned, the scientific, the social and political and economic aspects of pandemics. And so what she does is she uses cholera as this main overarching theme. And if you, there are lots of other pandemics in the book, but if you look at the book itself, it's mainly cholera is the main star of the whole book. And she takes cholera and she launches into so much depth and background, starting from, okay, what's the history of cholera? What does it look like when historians looked at it, starting from cholera epidemics in Europe in, what's the earliest date, the 1600s? Is there even earlier, Laura? But starting, does that sound right?
I was trying to mute myself politely.
Okay.
I don't remember. I think it all depends on how I think she talks a little bit about like historical evidence and how you can identify something as cholera when you're trying to piece things together from what you know of records of infections and records of outbreaks. She talks in the beginning a lot about when it kind of, I guess the idea is maybe it emerged in, what are those called, the Sundarbans? That kind of, it was like a low-lying wetland area in near the Bay of Bengal. So I think that maybe that was kind of thought to be perhaps its origin, but I think that's always hard to argue.
Well, and sure, I think she was talking about how cholera originated in the plankton of those very in that low-lying bay, and because of the interactions between the bay and the rice farmers and people farming in the area. And so what would happen is the bay would flood over with the sea. When the tide rose, the bay would flood over, and those very plankton would be washed into the rice fields where the farmers were working. And these farmers would now be in intimate contact with the cholera bacteria. And so what Sonia has mentioned in the book is that over time with this process is that cholera in close contact with these farmers eventually developed the mutation in which it would, once it was ingested into the farmer, that would be able to infect and cause sickness. I think in the beginning when she mentions this that she doesn't say that it's likely not an intense sickness because it's incredibly isolated. And throughout the book, she talks about how different mechanisms have been conducive to the passing of cholera, and mainly because of social interactions. So the interactions of the person with the bacteria in that area, then through locomotion. So she organizes this in chapters. So through locomotion, which is people carrying the bacteria. For example, like through large giant ships that would take in, I can't remember the technical term of what it's called.
Ballast water.
Ballast waters, thank you.
Yeah.
And large giant ships take in the ballast waters, and then they accumulate the water within the ship, and then they release them at their bay of port, which is a very convenient way of passing cholera around the world. And she also talks about planes, and the next chapter covers sanitation, and it's called Filth, which the first few pages was incredibly difficult to read while you're eating. It's highly not recommended. She also talks about social interactions with crowds, the political interactions with corruption, economics, and how it's difficult for people to accept a cure based on social perceptions. And so based on that, there's other chapters, like Chapter 8 is called Revenge of the Sea, which covers climate change, and then The Logic of Epidemics, which largely covers evolution and how pandemics came to be, and then the last one is talking about tracking pandemics. And so that's how the logic of that's a brief, very brief overview of the whole book, and I think everyone has their very own interest in what the book is. And so I wanted to go around and ask everyone, what was their favorite topic, and what was the topic that they would like us, or what topic would you like to discuss, or just share with us what your favorite topic was. And so I will start. Laura, why don't you start?
Okay, sure. That was a good summary. It's always hard to know how much of the book you want to summarize before you get started for people who might not know it well. So I think that was a really well done summary. Boy, I really enjoyed this book, and I think, Karen, you were the one to suggest it initially, and I'm really glad you did, because I honestly hadn't heard anything about it, and I'm really impressed with the really broad perspective that the author took to try to explore the different issues that come into play with disease outbreaks. So what I'll do is I'll just say the two things that I thought were most interesting, and then maybe if they overlap with what Joel and Nicole were interested in, we can kind of talk about those. So I'll just briefly say them, and then we can discuss further. I thought the chapter titled Filth, about sanitation, I just had such a wonderful appreciation for all of our indoor plumbing after reading that, and thinking, my God, if I had been in 1860s New York City, how terrible my drinking water would have been. Blah. But then, so that was really interesting to me. But also, I really appreciated the discussion about what you would kind of think to be maybe the anthropology of infectious disease, how social behaviors and social constructs and governments and economies and all of those things are an integral part of whether or not a disease spreads, where it spreads to, how it's contained. And I think it's very easy to take a reductionist approach when you're talking about infectious disease and just go through all of these different microbes and all the creepy things they do. But the fact that she really went into a lot of detail about the social side of things was really interesting to me as well. So those are the two things I was interested in. I'm happy to talk about them further, but maybe the other folks might want to see what they like.
Nicole, how about you? Or actually, what? Oh, so yeah. So Nicole, what? Are you still with us?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Am I audible now? I think I was muted. So. Okay.
Yep. Now we can hear you.
Okay. So I don't really know where to start with this, because I guess, like you, Laura, this book was a whole lot of thinking about what I should have done with my human ecology class 2 semesters ago, and it really should have been something like this book, because as far as a language level and limiting microbial terminology, or microbiological terminology, I should say, for that particular type of student cohort, it's quite beautifully done in this book. And I mean, she does hit on some very high-level conceptual ideas, like in the second last chapter about coevolution of pathogens, well, microbes that we classify as pathogens.
Yeah, that's a separate point that we could definitely talk about.
Yeah. Alongside the hosts they colonize, or the environmental context that allow them to acquire, not acquire, or realize that they need to actually make a living there. The thematic links between the actual chapters were quite well done, I thought, as well, in terms of linking some ideas that were fairly disparate. And I think the idea that you talk about, as far as a book that is very ecological, I mean, this is it. Chapter 2, the chapter called Corruption, which, even though it doesn't seem like apparent ecology, it's a big one. We actually have a political ecology course at our university. And the ideas about what the WHO actually does, which is a major misconception. It's true that they do a lot of data collection, but if you actually look at some commentaries on what their role is, they are a guidance organization. Whether or not you choose to weight your judgment of how they became that based on Sonia's commentary, I would still like to read more, although the way she presents it is, potentially very inflammatory when you think about, the economic influences. But the idea, there is a paper I am going to send you, Laura, and it does state that a lot of the WHO and the Codex guidance documents, they are guidance. They are not meant to exist as a sphere of influence. So this idea that we'll tell you what you should be doing, but we are not in a position to make suggestions that are, as some of the documents I've read, economically prohibitive. So they are not a governance force. And I mean, it's really nice to actually see that flushed out in a book like this.
Mm-hmm.
So I could keep going, but I think I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, we got things we could jump off of, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so that I just want to make sure that we come back to those things. Those things were talking about classification of bacteria of pathogens. Is that right?
Yes, as well as sort of the human behavior and pathogen sort of, microbial changes in relation to to their existence with hosts and social behaviors. So some of the stuff about kinship, tribalism, xenophobia as a social defense mechanism, not as a sociological, issue in and of itself. Things that were covered in the second last chapter and things that are addressed in corruption, I guess.
Okay, I will come back to that. Let's go to Joel. Joel, what did you enjoy most about the book?
Well, I like all the history part of it. They were talking about one of my favorite history parts that they did was when they were talking about the Manhattan Company.
Yes.
And how they basically wanted to form a waterworks as a way for a loophole to get a bank. And once they had their waterworks up and running and had their bank, they basically ignored the waterworks part of it. That was just crazy to me. So I like that part of it. And then let's see, the chapter on filth definitely crossed my mind a lot, or got me thinking a lot. Sometimes it brought me back to my younger years when I worked on a ranch, and we would get drinking water from the tap out by the corral, and it definitely smelled of cow. And I remember complaining about it when I was a kid, and my dad would just say, just drink it, it won't hurt you. And so I drank it for years, so I wonder how much I've ingested. But, and then we'd be eating our sandwiches during, say, lambing season or something, and I would be doing my best to hold on to the plastic part of my, the plastic bag on my sandwich, so I didn't actually touch my food with my hands, because there's no real good way to get them super clean out on the ranch. So that brought me back a lot. Something that I thought was kind of funny is that it seems like this author is not a dog person, because she would explain these absolutely horrible human waste conditions and just go off on it, and then she'd try to say dog feces in cities is on a par with that, and to me it's not even remotely close. Maybe I don't live in a big enough city or something, but I've never really, occasionally you might accidentally step in it and it's annoying, but it's certainly not on par with, you couldn't see the bricks in the road because it was covered with so much human waste. So anyway, I read between the lines and decided she didn't like dogs.
I kind of picked up on that too.
But anyway.
Sorry, continue.
I was going to say that's probably a good enough answer for now, but go ahead.
Well, speaking of personal young anecdotes about filth, I I grew there. I spent 2 years of my life in the south of Taiwan, and it was in the area, in the city that I was in. It was still very rural, and the city itself had this very, very unique smell. And for me, I had no idea what it was. It just smelled like home, or it just smelled like the hometown that I grew up in. And I didn't realize that it was actually the smell of sewage until I went to a sewage treatment plant on a field trip with it was a biotechnology course, and I walked into the sewage treatment plant, and there was just this smell at a much intense, pungent waft coming at me, and I was like, wow, this just smells like exactly what it was when I was a kid. And I was like, oh, now I realize I was actually smelling sewage. And I had no idea, because what the way that they had sewage is they had them in these open concrete gutters. And it was just very, very rudimentary, just open concrete gutters, and then with like these concrete kind of like slabs that you would press on top, but they had holes so that the smell could come out. And that was what I was smelling. I was smelling a sewage, but it was just really interesting because I told my prof, I'm like, oh, I walked into this plant and it smells like my home. And she just laughed. She had such a great time when I said
Oh boy. No, it's true though. I mean, yeah. That chapter. If I had to assign one chapter from this book, like if somebody forced me for a class to say like you can't assign the whole book, you have to assign a single chapter, I might pick that one just because I think it really registers with people. Not only is it well done because it makes you realize how important sanitation is to hinder the spread of infectious disease, but I also like the fact that whenever anybody talks about cholera or epidemiology, the story they always go to, which I do too, is, and she mentions it briefly, is Jon Snow in London with the Broad Street cholera outbreak. And that's a good story because it shows epidemiology, it has to do with cholera, it talks about the cesspool and how that was the source of the outbreak. I didn't know anything about the conditions for cholera in New York City in the 19th century. I didn't know anything about the Manhattan Company, like Joel had mentioned. There's a Hamilton connection for you, if there are people who are into Hamilton. And that's such a great example of it's a microcosm of all these themes that she's trying to bring together. And it's done in a way that I think people would really remember and then feel very fortunate that we currently have a well-regulated water system that tries very hard to separate our output from our input. Important.
And the solution just seemed to be incredibly simple, which was just clean water and separation of this output and input. Based on the history that she was covering, eradicated cholera in our main metropolitan cities. So it's not hard, which was very interesting in and of itself. I just want to quickly go and, because I see that Kat is here. Kat, are you with us? Kat?
I think she's kind of sort of with us from the beach. She's muted right now.
Okay. Kat?
Oh, look, she's got. Can you unmute yourself? Wait, maybe I can unmute her. Let's see. No. Let me try to unmute her. Whoops. No. There she is.
I think I'm losing you guys. You're coming in really spotty.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to comment that another thing, yeah, we had to change our thought. I don't know if you guys covered this. Sorry for coming in. The way we were thinking about diseases against this idea of miasmas to the germ theory, and how long it took for us to go from the miasma theory to the germ theory was pretty impressive. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, we got that. We got that through.
Yeah, we did.
She has the best setting of all of us. That's really that's beautiful. Yeah. So, excuse me. Sorry. Yeah. So I think what she was mentioning was, and I can't remember what chapter that comes into play, but the discussion. I think it's when we're talking a little bit more about. It might have been the chapter called "The Cure."
Yeah,
which is
it's in The Cure.
Not about the band. So just note that. But yeah, the idea of how tightly people will cling to a prevailing framework of thinking about something, a prevailing explanatory framework. So this idea of miasmas, this idea of this how long it took to convince people that that cholera was transmitted through the water. Like, and even in the face of evidence that people had collected, how frustrating that must be for those people who was the guy who went into a prison and did this great, well-controlled study, and things just demonstrated incredibly well that it was water that was causing cholera. And then when people came in to check his results, were like, well, they weren't near death, so clearly that's not cholera. You're like, that's good that they're not near death. But it just took a while for people to get convinced of this idea, and that held a lot back.
Nicole, sorry, Joel. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that was maybe my second favorite chapter. I think I have like 4 minutes left in it on the audiobook, but they made some good arguments for the miasma, because they're like, well, haven't you ever smelled something that was really terrible and you wanted to throw up and stuff like that? So I thought that was funny. And then I've always been a big fan of the Galen's four humors theory. I have a little YouTube channel that I haven't done much with lately, but my most watched videos are on CRISPR, but my second most watched video has to do with the four humors, and I just think people tend to find that theory of medicine really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Joel, can you elaborate on what the four humors are?
So I guess before they really had any science, before science was really figured out and like a process, people tried to understand the natural world, and then they would, for instance, for chemistry, they thought there were four elements. There's wind, water, earth, and fire. Is that right? I don't know. And then there's like four seasons. There's spring, summer, winter, and fall. And so categorizing things into four basic elements is kind of the idea behind humorism. And the reason it's called humorism is your body is supposed to have different liquids or things in it that control your health, and it would be blood, phlegm, black bile, and was it yellow bile? I can't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, there's four different humors that flow through your body, and I first heard about this humorism and how medicine was trying to balance your humors when I read The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee, and he's got a new book out, by the way, and I've started on that. Probably why I didn't quite finish this one is I had to go jump over to that one. I'm not very good at finishing things. But the idea is that you need to balance your four humors in order to be healthy, and the bloodletting and other things were like that, or purging. They talked about some sort of mercury treatment, which would cause people to throw up and other things. And anyway, those were all attempts by the early physicians to balance those four humors. So.
Oh, thanks, Joel. To just summarize how that relates to what we're reading about in the book, is that in the book, Sonia talks about how the view of the view of the medical community, which was based on I'm sorry, I know it's called Hippocrates, thank you, who was based on Hippocrates, who came up with this volume and collection of medical knowledge that at the time all of the doctors had to read as part of their training. Based on these philosophies, which revolved around the four humors, was the way that they diagnosed and treated cholera. But unfortunately, because this worldview that they had held was incorrect, the cure that they had come up with cholera was also incorrect. And so what Sonia is talking about is that scientists also have this distinct worldview of how we view things. And so before, they had this more holistic worldview of you had to balance the four humors. And she's saying that even though that they were incorrect back then and we have much more correct ideas now, we can still fall prey to the same problems, which is that now we look at things in isolation, very much in isolation. And Sonia talks about how that's in relation to the development of microscopy, which is that we looked at cells, and I do microscopy, so I can kind of understand that by the development of this microscopy culture, at the same time we've started to look at things in isolation, apart from other things. And I've also talked to different people about how disciplines have contributed to this as well. So biologists will only look at things from a biological standpoint, or physicists will only look at things from a physical standpoint, when in reality our biological system is biological, chemical, physical, social, and all of the balance of these things, because of our incredibly isolationist worldview, is problematic, because that's not relating to healing this person as a whole. And so what I did want to talk about is there any, other than that, in terms of isolationist, is there anything that between the four of us that we can think of that also is like that currently now, like worldviews that are in existence that we need to change, that if we changed would be helpful to battling pandemics?
Yeah, I was just I was gonna ask, like, do you mean for pandemics or generally? Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what you said about the idea of being very, very reductionist is right. I think that you've got this, exactly as you said, you get siloed, right? So this is a concept that people try to fight when they're thinking about things like this. They think, okay, well, you've got to get out of your individual silos. You've got to try to kind of figure out what are the connections between your field and other fields. Are there people taking data that speaks very much to a question you have that you just don't even realize that there's this insight that's available? I mean, I think for infectious diseases, it's trying to kind of do these things that we've just been discussing, which is, what are the economic roles? What are the political roles? What are the, structures that humans make that are kind of, what is the outcome of changing transportation networks? Like, what will that do? So trying to have a more holistic view of all of this, I think, is the right way to go. But that's hard to coordinate. So that's why it's not done as often, because it's really hard to coordinate that across agencies, across groups, across scientists. You have to take the time to learn a new vocabulary, and I think that's challenging. It's not an easy thing, that's for sure.
I think a big thing to mention with current cultures and politics and that sort of thing is to think about that we're just overloaded with information. I mean, the author brought up vaccines a little bit, and for every huge body of scientists you can have that say vaccines are good, you'll have some rogue scientist that does have a PhD and does, to the general public, look like they have okay credentials, spouting some sort of theory to the contrary, and this is a problem in the United States for the vaccines. But then the author did a nice job of talking about conspiracy theories that would come up in other countries that were that were trying to explain where the disease came from and how it's transferred or whatever. But anyway, a lot of that is just there's so much information that you can always find the information that supports your pet theory, whether your pet theory is right or wrong.
I thought another interesting. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I thought another interesting aspect of that was the anti-immigrant, thinking that this wave or that wave of immigrants is bringing in this disease or that disease, and the fact that it was just a political, the people were looking for a scapegoat, and the scapegoat wasn't always the weakest of the group. It was sometimes the most threatening, or I like the part where she talked about the fact that the doctors who are coming in, the UN doctors and whatnot, who are coming in to actually try to fight diseases, were seen as being politically, as possibly contributing to the disease, and part on the fact that politicians had actually had done that in the past, where they had brought in diseases or had brought in people who were pretending to fight diseases, and they actually weren't. They were actually either spreading propaganda or whatnot. I really enjoyed that connection, and I forgot where I was going to go with that. Sorry about that. I'm distracted by the beach.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I think that's very reasonable. No, the point you brought up, that was a good one. She makes a note in there about when the U.S. military was going after bin Laden, they did it under the cover of a vaccination campaign. And I think when that came to light, there were numerous health agencies that were absolutely incensed, because that is precisely what you don't want if you are trying to get the populations to work with you towards eradicating a disease. You need their cooperation for vaccination campaigns. You need their cooperation. They need to trust the healthcare workers that are sent out to help them. And I remember thinking to myself, too, that was a terrible, terrible idea, because you're going to get one guy, and then you're going to have put in danger these tremendously necessary healthcare campaigns that could potentially kill a heck of a lot more people. So that's part of it, too, is the ethical responsibility for all these agencies to understand what you need to do when you're entering into a situation that you are trying to provide and render aid. What are your ethical responsibilities? What are you supposed to do to work with the community? I mean, this is something we talk about in my non-majors class with the Ebola epidemic, is I have them read a couple of articles, and then we talk about, like, what went wrong, what should you be doing, like, what, if from your perspective, what do you think the people in these communities, what would they have needed in order to be more cooperative? Because that was a problem on the ground, for sure.
So I wouldn't mind making a few comments that build on Laura's comments as well as Kat's, because the interesting thing here, and a critical thing to remember, is that we look at public health initiatives, and I mean like the 4 or 5 of us, for what they are and for what their prospective benefits are, quite literally. When you do that, you are ignoring the buttressing of perceptions of international involvement by historical inequalities and exploitation, particularly between the West and, in some examples in the book, African nations. So the section where Sonia it was a facet of HIV denialism I hadn't even considered, even though I'm aware of the movement existing. The fact that they were downplaying even the existence of the virus, not really around arguing mechanisms of causality and transmission, but the fact that it just looked like a way of making things economically even harder in nations where they were trying to control things. And Laura, I think we all want to exist in a place where we think that there's always a primary ethically correct motivation for a health campaign, but clearly, as you said, when those Marines went to the island, that was not the case. And one thing that comes to mind is a paper that I gave to my class in human ecology. That's not a disease transmission example, but it was about a set of Pacific islands that WikiLeaks actually found a report where there was a military station there that was American, and part of the reason they were able to secure it and expropriate the persons who were living there is they actually sought out marine conservation status for the island that would have allowed them the occupation to set up the base. So, like, there is a culture of these binary connotative values of things that look positive, i.e. conservation efforts, i.e. public health efforts that look utilitarian and manipulative. And I think, especially as scientists and scientists not trained in policy and governance, we're very blind to the fact that these dualities are happening, and they are legitimate sources of hostility to efforts that are being made.
Well, and I don't want to steal your thunder on this one, but the example that they bring up of the New Delhi beta lactamase.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
that antibiotic resistance gene that was discovered in samples that were taken from New Delhi, and it is a relatively common thing for people. Like Ebola is named after the Ebola River. Lyme disease is named after Lyme, Connecticut. So it's a relatively common thing to name something that you found, be it a microbe or an antibiotic resistance gene, you name it after where you first found it. And I've read some really good arguments that practice should stop, because the idea that like the idea that like this New Delhi beta lactamase, they're like, oh my God, it's spreading from India everywhere, and India is the source of this problem, and it's like, well, we don't know that. I mean, we know that that's where it was first noticed.
Yeah.
But the idea of labeling something that comes with its own paranoia and fear with the name of a, that there were lots of arguments that people were saying, well, we don't want to call it that because this is just the West's continuing to blame developing countries for, disease problems. And I think that's a legitimate thing to think about, especially if you're going to do what she suggests at the end of the book, which is build this cohesive global surveillance network. You better learn how to play nice with each other, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
Absolutely.
Going back to Kat's previous comment, she had said something about scapegoating and immigrants, and it reminded me, my dad had sent me a news article recently, and the link was from a pretty far right-wing sort of news agency, quote-unquote news agency, and the basic idea was it was talking about the diseases that were occurring in refugee camps because of the Syrian war, and they're talking about increases in outbreaks of measles, outbreaks of this and that. My dad had sent it to me because it had said something about leishmania, which is the parasite that I had studied. So of course they had close-up pictures of these ulcers formed from a cutaneous leishmania infection, and the article went on to say that we've got sandflies in the United States, and if we let these immigrants in, they're going to spread leishmania all over the U.S. And I can tell you so many things that are wrong with that, but it was basically the entire argument was these people are getting diseases, so we don't want them. It wasn't like these people are in refugee camps and are under such terrible conditions that they're getting sick, It was very much not a compassionate look at the situation. It was well, that's all the more reason to keep them out, and I was just pretty horrified by the way that they twisted their logic to just say we don't want any of these people, and that's just not how I think. So that's it.
I think that's where it becomes important to go back to looking at the whole picture and going back to biology and economics and bringing it back to the really off-track point I was trying to make earlier, that we can't just look at the microbe, that we actually have to look at the conditions that are inducing the illnesses and picture. And I agree with her. I mean, for a long time there were people who, actually I think it's still currently true, that there are people who think of sociologists as being a lesser science, but really, they really help with identifying why epidemics are happening and why people don't trust the people who are coming in to help. Coming back to including everybody in on the discussions, I think is going to be an important part to preventing pandemics in the future as well.
Yeah, I
Sorry,
agree.
Laura, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say I agree. I think that's a good point.
No, I definitely agree with everything that everyone's brought up here, and so I think that that is a very good lead-in to, as scientists, what can we do about this? Like other than like that, we've made the very good first step of making ourselves knowledgeable and understanding the situation. But is there anything tangibly that, as in our everyday, that we can actually move forward with this perspective that would be helpful in changing things? Well, I mean, change is limited based on all that we understand about science, but is there anything that we could promote in terms of intercollaborations that would be helpful in this sense?
So I have not done this, but I know that the American Association for the Advancement of Science has something called the Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. And I know a couple people that have done them, so I should ask them about their experiences. But I think the idea is that you take people who have, I think you have to have a PhD. And what happens is, I think you go to Capitol Hill and they put you on the staff of policymakers, of legislators. And you are there to supply some of your scientific expertise, either within your particular area or because you have a science background. The idea being that you can handle interpretation of more technical topics within, like I don't think I could do well with like quantum physics, but I think I'd be able to handle, like we need to talk about disease ecology. Even though I'm not a disease ecologist, I think I could be like, okay, I can break down these papers for you into a summary of their major points and give you some guidance about, where I think you should go. I think it's really good. I don't know how well that works because I didn't do it. I should seek out some of the people who did and ask them what they thought, if they thought it was successful. But I think fostering those types of relationships are a really good idea. I think I see lots of efforts to get people comfortable talking to the media. I think that's a good idea. And I think there's a number of us who are teaching either introductory majors courses or non-majors courses. I think that's a really good idea too, because you're getting some exposure to people. This is, in the cases of my students, this is the only natural science class they're required to take if they're not a science major. So my hope is that coming out of it, they're going to have a greater appreciation of the complexity of these things. If we talk about the Ebola epidemic, we talk about the reaction in the United States, we talk about what happened on the ground, we talk about why it's important to have like a stronger international collaboration, and you hope that when they leave, that's something they take with them, so that when they hear it come up, they're like, hey, wait a minute, I remember why this is important. That's the idealistic viewpoint. Oh, Karen, I think you're muted.
There you go. Yeah. Nicole, did you have something to add?
Yeah, kind of. So, I mean, the idea of like this bridging these gaps between the social science aspect, which is so important in understanding societal responses and societal value orientations to what scientists are saying you might want to do. I mean, there's actually an author, and I think they're a social science orientation. They've written 2 papers, and one of them is actually the paradigm's climate change, because in all honesty, that sort of seems to have been the biggest scientific phenomenon that's been examined from a why haven't societal perceptions and societal behaviors changed. And these are the papers that have led to sort of the theoretical orientations about value polarities and how those actually affect your interpretation of information more than somebody slapping down in front of you a really nice causal model with, all the mechanics accounted for, bounded by good evidence. That's really not what seems to be the persuasive psychological process, and all helping people develop correct, accessible mental models of why they need to worry about things. So the Lyme section of the book that I think is in the last chapter, I mean, it's very clear to see what goes on there. First of all, as a society, when you talk to anybody with a condition that has atypical or irregular symptom presentation of ongoing duration over a long period of time, chronic disease does not fit the image culture of a pandemic. Like, we've been brainwashed by things like the movie Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman. And if it doesn't look like The Duck, where the duck is like the commonly perpetuated image of an infectious disease, we are suspicious of it. And that's limiting your time to getting to the doctor, that's limiting your persistence in looking for a second opinion if you need it. And it's also limiting the societal worldview of what an infectious disease looks like. So even though a lot of us, and even though we're not trying to saturate the market with science communicators, having that as a repertoire in how to articulate ourselves beyond the journals we're trying to publish in, I think is really a key thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure I had something secondary to say, but I can't remember what it is, so I'll just stop now.
Oh, that's all right. If you think of it later, you're welcome to just hop in. I was just going to add on to both your and Laura's comments, which is that I really agree with, just that facts. Oh, sorry. So for Laura's comments, Laura was talking about educating students. And I think that's definitely something that we are all a part of every single day, that as we put extra dimensions on top of our education, instead of just looking at it from a purely scientific point of view, that these students will have a richer education because they'll understand that science is not just science that happens in a vacuum and in isolation away from everything else in the world, but it very much is this rich and complex interactions of all of these different fields and different things that are happening. And now, as we become a more globalized society, it's more and more imperative that we're able to interconnect all of these things together to actually work together to further science, to not just further science, but to actually help people in terms of the context of pandemics. So I think that teaching, in that sense, is also a very important way to move forward. And I also really like the point that you brought up, Nicole, which is that facts are no longer very persuasive anymore. Like, you can't just plop down a theory. It's like, okay, here's exactly what it is. Because that will only convince a certain number of people. Like, not every, there are a population of people that will be convinced by the facts, but there are other populations of people that think differently, and so facts won't necessarily convince them. And we can't just say, okay, facts don't convince you, and we're going to ignore that. That there's a part of that we do need to take a different perspective of how we present things in science communication, so that we can communicate our points across to these people and mitigate that balance together. Okay. Does anyone have anything else that they want to add to that, Joel?
Yeah, I didn't want to. I just wanted to hop on really quick. I was just going to say, for following up with Karen with the teaching idea, is one of the things as I was reading through this, one of the things I complained to my husband about was that oftentimes in my department, because we're primarily undergraduate, we have all of biology in one department, and we kind of have this false dichotomy of big bio and little bio, and it seems like the vast plethora of our pre-med students always gravitate towards little bio because they're like, I want to study microbiology and molecular biology and cellular biology because I have to learn about cancer and I have to learn about disease and ecology, whatever. You're like, no, you need to take ecology because you need to understand how not only for infectious disease, but also things that Nicole brought up, that things that are not infectious diseases, there are chronic diseases that might have an infectious origin, but beyond even infectious diseases, cancers and other things like that, there are definitely environmental, social, behavioral factors. The ecological framework is very helpful for understanding them. So not only the non-majors, but I think the majors too kind of need to have a better appreciation of that. And then I'm sorry, Joel, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I don't have, I'm not teaching any sort of introductory microbiology class or health sciences class, to go along with the topic of this book, but this fall I am going to develop a class on Intro to Evolution, and so this just pounding them with the facts is not going to work, or at least, like Karen said, for a certain population it's not going to work. I've picked a textbook by Carl Zimmer It's called the Tangled Bank, and it does a lot of describing what the scientists are doing to collect their data and how that can be an example of these different principles. And so I'm a little, to be honest, I'm a little nervous about going into this evolution class because I'm not super well trained on evolution, but just the other intro class I have is the intro to like water is polar and proteins and DNA and here's metabolism breakdown, and those are pretty much not very there's no opposition to those ideas. So I'm a little worried about being able to stay on my feet enough to.
I'm staunchly anti-glycolysis. I don't know what your problem is. That's okay. Okay.
Yeah. So you avoid gluten-free foods and everything for you. All right. Well, anyway, I'm just following up on the discussion of teaching undergrads, but I started my YouTube channel with these grand visions of getting a hold of a lot of people and explaining some basic science concepts, and I don't really know what I never really set out with a success, a definition of what was going to be success with the channel. I do know that when I got into teaching the whole time, thinking up a new lesson for my YouTube channel was just kind of the last thing I felt like doing this spring. But anyway, maybe someday I'll get motivated and get it going again. I probably talk about it more here than I actually put it into real life practice. But that's a way to reach out to people. Because everyone looks to YouTube for how to do things or a quick or explanation of something. So maybe I'll get back to it someday, and that can be my contribution.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say before I forget, there's a it's hosted by Berkeley. I think it has multiple sponsors, but maybe you've seen it already. It's a website called Understanding Evolution, and it is fantastic. It is very, very good. They have a lot of material developed. They do things like they talk about what are common myths that people, or misconceptions that people have about evolution, and then they walk through them, and then they walk through explanations to try to help people clarify things. And it's got stuff set up for all ranges of students. So I've gone to that website. I've gone to that well a lot. It's a really good website. And they've got a companion one called Understanding Science, that is just more generally about thinking scientifically and the scientific process. And it's good because I think they're updating it fairly regularly. So when you go to the scientific process, it's not just like the 5-step. They've got this much broader network that they show that's like, look, science is complicated, and here's all the various things that you have to do. And so those are both very good websites. But
I just wanted to quickly, because we're approaching on at the end of our time, but right before we end, I know that Laura and Nicole, you guys wanted to talk about anthropological behaviors, and was in the second to the last chapter. Was that the chapter on immune behaviors, or also like I'm sorry, I'm butchering this. Does Nicole, are you still with us?
Still, sorry. I am unmuted now, and I'm still with you. I have one soundbite about that, which has sort of been brewing in my mind in the last few minutes. It's basically having to do with the idea that Sonia brought up about how in early tribal social organizational systems you had sort of like immune protection repertoires of behavior, which included things like excluding new non-tribal members from coming into your community. And the idea about where we are now in 2016, which I think we can agree, and I mean especially facilitating a meeting like this to happen based on where we are in a technocratic society. So, and I think also in light of some of what we've seen as the outcome of Brexit, that these ideas about non-kinship strangers and very low-tech mechanisms of manipulating population density are not really compatible with some of the ethical systems that I'd like to think actually exist in place for social harmony and what we should be aspiring to for social organization. So it's this idea that, like, we are now where we are in 2016, and I think we need to rely on our intellect, and I guess not further. I mean, the book very clearly exemplifies we have not conquered nature, even though in the time when we were acquiring knowledge and in the time when we actually had high efficacy of antibiotics and long periods of time between cholera outbreaks, that it seemed like that was the case. It doesn't mean that we can't still leverage creation of new infrastructures, creation of new data collection and monitoring methods, and creation of unconventional urban planning mechanisms to deal with things like the eventual onslaught of climate change refugees, for instance. There will have to be movement of people to keep people alive if we believe that there is an ethical imperative to keep people alive. It's just going to have to operate on us being more intellectually having that ingenuity, and also making certain things new economic priorities. So that's my take on anthropology, I guess, briefly, and disease.
I think that's great. I don't have anything to add to that. That was very well said.
Okay, so just I really enjoyed this conversation. I think everyone has also really enjoyed our conversation about all these dimensions of pandemics. So just before we end, I want to talk briefly about our July book club, which is that we're taking suggestions for books. And so right now on the website there's a list of, I think 3 or 4 books that you can vote on. You can tweet Laura, or you can tweet me about which ones that you guys want to choose for our July book club, and we'll pick one and then we'll set a date. And so with that, we're just at the end of our time, so I'd like to say thanks for watching. And if you want to participate in our next book club, just continue to follow Laura and I on Twitter, and we will tweet out and let you know when that will happen. Okay, take care, and
Thank you.
have a great day. Bye.
Bye.